Welcome back to episode 5 of this Ultimate Excel Dashboard tutorial series. I'm super excited because with this episode we will start building custom interactive dashboard features that I can guarantee you will not find in Excel by default. They will make your dashboard just super awesome. Today I show you how to build interactive info buttons to display and hide extra information. Why is this really useful? Because you barely need any space in your dashboard for making extra information available to the dashboard user, since the actual information box is hidden and only displayed when the dashboard user needs it. You're only gonna need some tiny little space for that info button. So I want to show you how to do that, and to make it even better, I will show you 3 different ways to do it. Going from quick, simple, but not so scalable, to advanced and really scalable. So based on how many of these info buttons you want to have in your dashboard, one or the other option might be more relevant to you. I recommend to stick with me for the whole tutorial and make your decision at the end. So without further ado, let's get right into it. If you want to have a decent starting point for building these custom interactive features, I recommend to download the basic interactive Excel dashboard from excelfind.com. And since this dashboard has been built with the Office 365 Excel version, I recommend to upgrade your version for this if you haven't already. The whole interactive characteristic of these info buttons will come from a VBA script. But before we dive into the different VBA script options, we first have to build the actual info button and info box elements based on already existing basic Excel features. Let's start with the info button. For that, we're simply gonna use a nice looking icon from the Excel integrated icon library, which is pretty awesome but only available in Office 365. If you don't have that version, you can of course just use another shape for that. Let's insert it. Make it white because that's the color of the inactive state of this button. And it perfectly fits into this dashboard from a visual standpoint. Then we duplicate it because we start with having 2 different button elements, one for the active state of the button, we will make that one yellow, and one for the inactive state, that's the white one. For now we just place them next to each other and continue with the info box. For the info box, we need a simple rectangle shape. You can make that one as big or small as you want. Just make sure that it is smaller than the tile it is in. It shouldn't cross the tile borders. Let's do some quick formatting for that box. We set the fill to white and make it slightly transparent. 10% transparency is a good value for that, and it shouldn't be much higher. Then also remove the line. And then we add a text box for this info box content. Now, why don't we just write the text into that rectangle shape directly? Because that way you have way less control of the text positioning inside the box. Of course, that text box should have no fill and no line. And we adjust the size in a way that it more or less covers the rectangle below. Since both these elements are part of the info box, we finally group them together. Let's make the font size a bit smaller and insert some useful information. What to put inside there is totally up to you. For this specific tile, I think it might, for example, make sense to specify what does on time in the left donut actually mean. So, is there any tolerance for a delivery to be still on time by definition? We just define a tolerance of 3 hours. Perfect. The next step is really crucial, not too much fun, but totally underrated. Always, if you build stuff like this, especially if you want to reference objects in a VBA script later on, you need to give these relevant object names that make them quickly and uniquely identifiable. Just open the selection pane. This is where all the objects in your worksheet are listed. In there, you have full control over the visibility and the visibility order of all these objects. And of course, you can also change the object names. By default, they just have these generic names based on their object type and an incrementing number. But we don't like that. We will give our info box objects some real and unique names so that we can easily reference them later. We have 3 relevant objects here. Let's call the group info box deliveries, and these icon objects info button deliveries active and inactive. Honestly, do yourself a favor and use a clean and consistent structure for these names. That makes everything so much easier. Okay, that's already it for the required elements. Let's start writing some VBA scripts. As I told you at the beginning, I want to show you 3 options, with the first option being the most simple one, but also the least scalable. We go to the Developer tab and open the Visual Basic editor. That first simple VBA option works with 2 button shapes, one for the active and one for the inactive state, and consists of 2 simple macros, one for each button shape. The first macro, or more precisely sub, will make the info box appear, so we call it display info box deliveries. We need no parameters for that, so we leave the brackets empty. Later, we will connect that to our inactive button. So every time you click on that inactive white button, the script will be executed, and what we wanted to do is to make the info box appear, make the active button appear as well, and make the inactive box itself disappear. Easy as that. Now, inside of this subsequence, we start with a with statement and type with active sheet, because all the shapes we will reference inside of that with statement are in the active sheet, so now we don't have to type active sheet multiple times. And now we're gonna adjust the visibility status of our 3 objects, starting with the inactive info button. So we type .shapes, put the name of the object inside of the brackets, .visible equals false. Let's quickly check if we remember that name right by opening the selection pane. And yeah, that should be fine. Let's continue with the next shape, which is the active button. And we obviously want to make that one appear, so we set the visibility to true. And the last element is the info box. We set that to true as well. And at this point, we really appreciate that we have grouped the rectangle and the text box into one group, because that saves us one line of code every time we reference it. And that is already it for this first macro. The second macro is just designed the other way around. We want it to be executed when we click the active state button, and then we wanted to make the info box disappear just like the active state button itself, and the inactive state button reappear. So everything will be reset to the original default state. For that reason, the statements inside the sub will just be the same, like for the first macro, but with reversed Boolean values. So we can simply copy it and then switch the true and false values. To make the script work now, we have to assign the 2 macros to the both button shapes. In order to assign a macro to a shape, we need to right-click on that shape and click on Assign Macro. That will open a pop-up window where we can choose between all macros available in this worksheet. We select the Display Info Box Deliveries macro and click on OK. And then we do the same for the yellow button shape and the Hide Info Box Deliveries macro. Let's test it. And as you see, everything works perfectly like it should. Awesome. Now, the only thing left to do is we need to place the yellow button exactly at the same position of the white one to create the illusion that it is just one button. Let's speed that up. And after that alignment, everything is perfectly set up. Now, that is what I would call the quick and dirty solution. If you only want to have one info button in there, with this solution you are absolutely fine, no worries. But if you want to have multiple info buttons in different tiles, you should do some things different. What I will do in VBA script option 2 is adding a function. A function is basically pretty much the same like a sub, with the only difference that it can return values and cannot be assigned to a shape. So it is something that should be used to handle core functionality that are needed repeatedly. And that is exactly what we are going to use this function for, because we will put in the whole core functionality, which is simply spoken, making our objects appear and disappear. But why does it make sense to do that, to outsource this core functionality to a separate function? For 2 good reasons. Number 1, it makes scaling much easier as we don't have to copy over the whole code for each new button, and at the same time it reduces the risk of mistakenly changing the core functionality when copy and pasting. And number 2, let's assume we want to change or fix something in this core functionality, and we have multiple buttons. Then we would have to go through the code of every button and do the code changes multiple times instead of just only once. For everyone with some programming knowledge, this should be a no-brainer. So let's insert that function. We call it change info box visibility. And that function now has parameters or arguments, whatever term you prefer, because we will call this function in the subs that are connected to the info buttons, and these arguments will contain information that will make the function know what to change and how to change it. The first three arguments are describing what to change. So the function expects an info button active object, an info button inactive object, and an info box object. And the how is described in this visible argument. That means based on if we pass true or false for that parameter, when calling the function, it will either, if the value is true, set the inactive info button object that we pass over to not visible, and the active info button object and info box object to visible, or, if it is false, set these Boolean values the other way around. Now we have all the core functionality in this one function and can call it as often as we want within our subs below. That means in our subs below, instead of explicitly changing the visibility status by hand, we just call that defined function, still within the with statement, and pass the three relevant shapes as parameters, plus a value for the visible parameter. For the display info box delivery sub, this visible parameter is set to true. And for the hide info box delivery sub, we will simply change it to false. And now, if we want to create multiple buttons, we only have to control one Boolean parameter instead of three when copying and pasting that one line of code. Let's quickly make sure it works just fine. And as you see, it works perfectly. That's already pretty good. Now let me tell you about the motivation for showing you a third, even more advanced option for doing this. If we now want to create a second and third and fourth button, yeah, it will be already easier and cleaner with option 2 that we just implemented, but we will still have three different shapes that have to be copied, then repositioned, renamed both in the selection pane and in the VBA script, and we have to assign two macros to two different button shapes every single time we add another button. So the scaling would be much easier and less time intensive if we had less shapes. More specifically, if we only had one button shape and not two for each state of the button. Well, I showed you these first options with two button shapes because it is the more intuitive and straightforward approach of doing this. And now if we want to do the same with only one button shape, we have to find answers to a few questions first. The first question is, how can we make this one object behave exactly the way the two shapes behaved when they changed each other's visibility status before? And the second question is, we only can assign one macro per object. How can we implement the display and hide functionality at once in one macro? Because how will the macro know what operation to do next when we click on that button? I hope you are still with me. No worries, it is easier than you think and it will be pretty awesome. Let's switch back to the Visual Basic editor. So yeah, option 3 will only have one button shape, still one function, but also only one macro that will be assigned to that button shape. That means we can now delete one of the button shapes and rename the other one, because now we don't need the additional descriptor active or inactive anymore. And back in our script, in the same manner, we're going to rename the first argument in our function and delete the second one. The first question to answer was, how do we replace the behavior that these two button shapes had before, making the other one visible and itself invisible, and thus creating the illusion of having one object that simply changes colors. What we do now is, we just directly implement what has been an illusion before. And by that I mean, we make the button change its color. We do that by, instead of accessing the visibility property of that shape, we access the fill property of that shape. Within the fill property, we need to reference the forecolor as an RGB code, which stands for red, green, blue. Here, we are expected to assign an RGB object with values that specify the red, green, and blue intensity of the color. By the way, 255 is the maximum. For those familiar with designing and color theory, you should know that red plus green makes yellow, because that's the color we want for our button when it is set to active. The next line of code for the info box visibility will just stay the same. For the inactive state, we want the button to become white, and for that reason we type in the exact command, but this time with the color code for white, which is 3 times 255. Now, a critical viewer might ask himself, well, this changing of colors is nice, but we also could just leave it white for both states, no reason to have that extra code. But then I have to say no, because having these two different colors is part of the solution for our second problem, the actual main problem, which was, how does the macro know which of both operations, either displaying or hiding the info box, it shall do next? Because now with these two different colors we have a property in our button from which we can derive a simple rule. And that rule is, when the button is clicked and the button is currently white, then do the display operation. Otherwise, do the hide operation. So let's just implement that rule in one single sub. We just call it change info box deliveries visibility. And then we access the fill property, make an if statement based on whether the fill is white or not, if it is white, we call the upper function. Now we only have to pass two objects, button and info box, plus the true. And else, we call the same function and just change the true to false. And that is all the code we need for that third option. It's the cleanest and by far the best option if you want to scale it, which I'll show you in a minute. First, let's try if that solution with the one button works. Oh, okay, we forgot to assign the new sub. We renamed it and the button has still assigned one of the old two subs that don't exist anymore. So let's quickly do that. There we go. And now it works perfectly. Beautiful. I mean, I talked a lot about scaling in this video, so creating multiple buttons. And now I'm gonna demonstrate that all the work was worth it, especially the work we put into option 2 and 3. Let's create a second button. That button will be for the customer acquisition tile, and of course it makes sense to have different information in here. For now, let's just leave the main tags blank. We only have to change the name of these two objects now. Let's just change the last part into CA, which stands for Customer Acquisition. And now we can open the Visual Basic editor again. And since we have that third option implemented at the moment, all we have to do now is simply copying this one tiny macro and replace the word deliveries with CA 6 times. And then assign the new macro to the new button shape. And that's already it. That's what I call a clean implementation. Finally, to demonstrate you the power of having the core functionality in one single function, let's assume we have not only two, but way more buttons in this dashboard. And we are not satisfied with that yellow color for the active state. And now we want to test alternative colors for all buttons. Let's say we want to test the color red first for all buttons in their active state. And with this third VBA script option in place, all we have to do now is to change one single value in the script to make it happen for all buttons at once. That's the magic. Just double click to make the script run through once. And yes. Easy. Works perfectly for both buttons. Well, that's it for this first custom interactive dashboard feature in our Ultimate Excel dashboard. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I can tell you the next tutorial will be just as awesome, as I'm gonna show you how to build fully functional tabs within a tile for your dashboard. That allows you to make more content, more charts available to your dashboard user without any additional space required. So you definitely shouldn't miss that one. And you also shouldn't miss the wonderful website excelfind.com for powerful Excel resources and knowledge. If you like this tutorial, let me know in the comments. I really appreciate all the positive and constructive feedback I get from all of you. Thank you so much for that, and see you next time. Cheers!